There is a kind of violence that does not leave marks where doctors look. It does not fracture bone. It does not pool blood. It lives, instead, in the deliberate unmaking of a person, the ritual erasure that a community performs when it decides, without vote or trial, that someone has stopped being human enough to protect. I have read every field report from the Arizona Territory between 1871 and 1889. I have held letters written in pencil so faint they nearly breathed their last. I have sat across tables from men who called themselves historians and watched them skip over the names of women the way a stone skips over water, touching, bouncing off, moving on. Her name was Siki. Not a footnote. Not an Apache woman, unidentified. Not a casualty of the period. Siki. And the man who walked into the middle of what was about to happen to her, the man the town had already written off as half gone, a rancher so removed from civic life he hadn't set foot in Cabra Wells in 11 months, that man had no heroic music swelling behind him. No audience. No plan. He just had a Winchester, a mule named Gerald who hated everyone equally, and 34 years of living alone on land that had taught him the particular grammar of cruelty. He recognized it when he saw it. He knew what it sounded like when a crowd stopped being a crowd and became something else. What follows is not a story about rescue. It is a story about two people, a woman who had already survived more than the moment you were about to witness, and a man who had spent a decade trying to disappear, learning, in the span of a single brutal afternoon, that survival is not something you do alone. It never was. Read carefully. The part that will stay with you is not the violence. It is what she said to him afterward, when her face was still blackened and her shorn hair lay in the dust, and he stood there not knowing what to do with his hands. It is what she said, and the fact that she was the one who said it. I should explain what I was doing in Cabra Wells the morning it happened. The honest answer is that I was lost. Not directionally, I knew perfectly well that the territorial road ran southwest and would deliver me to Tucson by nightfall if I pushed the horse. Lost in the other sense. The sense that a man gets at 41 when he has been transcribing other people's histories for 19 years and has begun to feel that his own life is a margin note on a document whose main text concerns someone else entirely. My name is Edmund Pruitt. I was, at the time, a field correspondent for the Bureau of Ethnological Survey, a title that sounded more official than it was, covering as it did the work of riding into territories other men called dangerous and writing down what I found there. Not what I decided to find. What was actually there. That distinction mattered to me, once. I had started the work believing it was a form of respect to see, to record, to not flinch. I fidgeted with my fountain pen when I was thinking. I was always thinking. My right index finger had a permanent ink stain that I'd stopped trying to remove somewhere around 1878. I mention all of this because you need to understand what kind of observer I was before that afternoon. I was the kind who stood outside things. Who watched? Who wrote? The man appeared distressed, rather than placing himself in the scene. That changed in Cabra Wells. The town was not remarkable. A wide dirt main street, a hardware store, a dry goods establishment, a saloon with a broken shutter that banged in the wind like a slow, bored applause. Maybe 200 residents if you counted generously, which I was inclined to do. I had ridden in for water and a meal and, perhaps to ask the postmaster if there was anything waiting for me under the name Pruitt, which there never was, but asking had become a habit I couldn't break. I was tying my horse to the post outside Henley's Dry Goods when I heard it. Not shouting. That's the part people always get wrong when they retell mob moments, they expect volume. What I heard was a murmur. The specific kind of murmur that happens when a group of people are all looking at the same thing and have arrived, independently, at the same conclusion about what should be done. A sound like a tide making up its mind. I came around the corner of the building and stopped walking. There were perhaps 30 people in the open space behind the livery. More gathering. A woman at the center. She was Apache. I knew this from the construction of her dress, the particular silver work at her wrists, the way she stood, not cowering, not performing defiance, just standing the way a person stands when they have made a private calculation about what is and is not worth energy. She was young, I thought. 23, 25. A face that had not yet finished deciding which version of itself it would be. Two men flanked her. One held her arms from behind. Not roughly, or rather, roughly in the way that people are rough when they believe their roughness is sanctioned, which is the most dangerous kind. The other held a pair of shears. I knew what was coming. I had read about it. Punitive haircutting, the specific humiliation applied to Apache women accused of betrayal, collaboration, sleeping with the wrong man or the wrong enemy, being seen in the wrong place by the wrong eyes. The accusation didn't require evidence. It required consensus. The crowd had consensus. What it did not have, yet, was the blackening. That would come after. Ash or soot rubbed into the face, the mark that said, "This person is less than." The visual declaration, worn until it wore off or was washed away, that a woman had been found and judged by her community and found wanting. I stood at the edge of the crowd. I had my pen in my hand. I noticed this because the pen was uncapped, which meant my fingers had moved without my instruction. The ink stain on my index finger. I thought, I should write this down. I thought, I should stop this. I thought, I don't know how to stop this. These three thoughts arrived in that order, and I am not proud of the interval between the second and third. Her name, I did not know it yet. I would not know it for another hour. I watched her face during the interval of the murmur, during the moment before the shears opened, and what I saw was not fear. Not exactly. It was a specific kind of withdrawal, the face a person makes when they decide that what is about to happen will not be allowed to reach the part of them that matters. She had pulled herself somewhere interior. Somewhere the crowd couldn't follow. The shears opened. And, then, the voice came from behind the crowd, and everything stopped. Not loud. That's the second thing people get wrong about the moments that change a scene. The voice was not loud. It was level. It had the particular flatness of a man who has run out of patience for theater, including his own. Put those down. I turned, along with the rest of the crowd. He was not impressive to look at. This I recorded dutifully, in the field notes I would write that evening by lantern light, because it seemed important. He was tall in the way that ranch work makes men tall, stretched rather than built, like something that had been pulled upward over years of fence posting and lifting and bending. His coat was wrong for the weather, either too heavy or too light, the kind of coat you wear because it is the coat you have. Gray-brown, the color of dust that has been rained on and dried again. He had a beard that was losing its argument with his face. He was leading a mule. The mule was regarding the assembled crowd with an expression of profound contempt that I found, under the circumstances, somewhat bracing. The man with the shears turned. "Harlan. This ain't your business. I didn't ask what it was. Go on home. Put them down." The crowd shifted. I have spent years studying the way crowds move, the way they redistribute weight and intention, and what happened in that moment was instructive. They did not surge toward him. They hesitated. Which meant his presence had introduced uncertainty into an equation that had felt, moments before, complete. Harlan. I filed the name. He hadn't raised the Winchester yet. It was held at his side, loosely, the way you hold a thing when you need both parties to remember it's there without making it the entire conversation. "She's a collaborator," a woman in the crowd said. Her voice was controlled. The kind of control that takes practice. She was seen at the military camp. With one of them. "I know," Harlan said. This surprised her. It surprised me. "You know." I know what she was doing at the camp. She was bringing my laundry. She does my laundry. Has done for 8 months. That's the man she was with, Sergeant Rourke, who has approximately the romantic appeal of a fence post, and who paid her 60 cents a week because I asked him to help me find someone to do the work after my back went bad. Silence. Not the productive kind. The kind that happens when a crowd has committed itself to a story and someone has, publicly and irrevocably, introduced a different one. The man with the shears did not put them down. Not yet. I watched his jaw. His jaw was doing something complicated, working through the distance between what he'd believed 60 seconds ago and what he was being forced to hold now. It is an underrated physical sensation, the moment of having to revise. You got proof of that? I got Sergeant Rourke. Who I expect could be in front of you in about 40 minutes if you want to sit in the sun and wait. Another silence. Or, Harlan said, and something in his voice shifted so slightly I might have invented it, you could consider that you were about to do something to a woman who does laundry for a living and has done nothing to you. And you could walk away from it before it becomes the thing you remember about yourself. What happened next was not dramatic. This is important. This is the part that films and recountings always get wrong about the moments that do not become massacres. They are undramatic. The man with the shears handed them to his companion and walked away. Not in shame, or not only in shame. In the complicated posture of a man who has been given an exit he didn't deserve and has decided, without announcement, to take it. The crowd unraveled. Slowly, then, all at once, the way crowds do when the gravity that held them together neutralizes. People walked back toward the main street. A few glanced at Harlan. None of them spoke to him. The man who had been holding her arms released them and followed the rest. She stood where she'd been standing. Hair intact. Face clean. She did not look at Harlan. She looked at her own wrists, at the silver there, and she did something with her hands that I did not recognize, a small movement, deliberate, like resetting something. Then, she looked up, and she looked at me. Not at Harlan. At me. I was still standing at the edge of the former crowd with my uncapped pen and my ink-stained finger and my notebook open to a page I had not written a single word on. Her eyes were the specific dark of creek water in shade. They held absolutely no expression for me. I had the sudden, nauseating certainty that she had registered, with precision, the exact interval between my second thought and my third, and found it precisely as long as it was. I capped the pen. Harlan moved toward her. Not quickly. The way you move toward a person when you're not sure of your reception and you're trying to communicate, through pace alone, that you're not a threat. You all right? She said nothing for a moment. Then, your mule bites. He does, Harlan agreed. I apologize for him. Not the mule. A pause. Understanding shifted across his face like weather. No, he said. Not the mule. I apologize for them too. That's not yours to give. No, he said again. It's not. She picked up a basket from the ground that I hadn't noticed. It had been sitting there, I realized, the whole time, something she'd set down when they first stopped her, a basket of laundry. Domestic and incongruous and devastating in its ordinariness. She looked at him the way you look at a man when you're deciding whether he gets to accompany you. Gerald bites strangers, she said, meaning the mule. I am not a stranger. She walked. Gerald fell into step beside her, as if they had an existing arrangement. Harlan stood for a moment, watching them. Then, he followed. Because there was nothing else logical to do. I stood alone in the empty space where the crowd had been. The dust was still settling. There was a single hair in the dirt near my boot, I don't know whose, and it caught the afternoon light for a moment, silver, before the wind took it. I looked at my open notebook. I wrote her name. Find her name. Then, I wrote, because I have a weakness for honesty even when it shames me, you stood at the edge and uncapped your pen. Then, I went to find the postmaster. There was still nothing waiting for me. There never was. But, for the first time in a long time, the margin note I was writing felt like it belonged to something. I found her name the way I found most things in the field, obliquely. It was the postmaster, Fitch, a man shaped like a question mark both physically and philosophically, who told me while handing me nothing. The Apache woman Harlan's been working with? Goes by Siki. Some of them have longer names, the real ones, but Siki's what she gives in town. What's the real one? He shrugged. Not mine to know. I thought about this. The architecture of a name that you keep and a name that you give, a name for the town's use, a name that means nothing to you, a name you hand over like a coin that isn't currency anywhere that matters. I had been doing this work for 19 years and I was still capable of being blindsided by the specific, structural loneliness of that. I wrote Siki in my notebook. Then, I sat with the inadequacy of it. I found the ranch by following the road that Fitch described, southwest of town, through scrub that was doing its level best to become desert. "1.5 miles," he said. I rode nearly 2 before I saw the structure, low, practical, the kind of building that has stopped trying to be anything other than functional. Adobe and wood. A water pump that looked recently repaired. A line of laundry that was already dry in the afternoon heat. I stopped at the edge of the property. There is a specific ethical dimension to arriving uninvited at a place where 2 people have just been through something, and I was working through it when Siki appeared in the doorway and looked at me. She had changed her dress. Her wrists were still silver-worked. Her face was utterly composed. "The writing man," she said. "Edmund Pruitt," I said. "I'm sorry to intrude." "Are you?" I considered. "I want to be useful." "I don't know if I am." She looked at me for a long moment with those creekwater eyes. Then, she stepped back from the doorway, which I interpreted, correctly, as an invitation that stopped well short of welcome. The interior of the ranch was spare in the way that Harlan himself was spare, nothing present that wasn't earning its keep, nothing ornamental except for a single item on the shelf near the east window, a child's moccasin. Worn. 1. No pair. I noticed it. I did not ask. Siki made coffee with the certainty of someone doing something she did not need to think about while thinking about something else entirely. Harlan sat at the table with the mule-weary posture of a man who was not comfortable in his own kitchen when someone else was in it, not hostile, just uncertain of the choreography. I sat across from him. I had my notebook out. I realized I was about to ask to take it out and it was already out, which was the kind of reflex that I had let masquerade as professionalism for 2 decades. I put it away. Harlan watched this. Something in his assessment of me shifted, very slightly, toward tolerable. "What do you write?" he asked. "Field reports. Observations. I work for the Bureau of Ethnological Survey." "I know what that is." "Then, you know more about it than most people out here." "I used to read," he said. The past tense landed and sat there and neither of us commented on it. Siki set 3 cups down and sat beside the window rather than at the table. Not excluded, positioned. The angle gave her the door and the room both, and I thought, she has spent a long time thinking about where to sit. "You want to ask me something," she said. "Not a question. I want to understand what happened today." "You were there." "I was at the edge of it." She looked at her coffee. The steam moved. "Yes," she said. "You were." The second reference to my interval. She was not going to let it go, and I respected her for it even as it made me want to apologize again, which I suspected she would find useless. What she told me came out in pieces, over the course of 2 hours, not as testimony, I want to be precise about this, but as the kind of talk that happens when 2 people are sharing space and one of them has been holding something for a while and the other is quiet enough to not require it to be shaped properly. Her family had come from a band that had been settled on a reservation the previous decade. The settlement had gone the way settlements go, badly, then, worse, then, into a silence that is somehow louder than the disaster that preceded it. Her mother had died during a winter that the official reports called a difficult season. Her father had, in her words, walked away from himself, which was the most accurate description of a man's dissolution I had ever heard, 2 words doing the structural work of a medical history. She had been 17 when she came west on her own. 22 now. 5 years of finding the kind of work that was available to Apache women in territorial Arizona: laundry, cooking, hide work, and building, from that thin material, something that functioned like a life. They knew, she said at one point. About the camp. About the sergeant. They didn't care what it was. They had decided what it was. Yes, I said. This is not the first time. No, I said. I know. Do you? Not a challenge. A test. The specific test that people who have been failed by observers extend to new observers, the test of whether you understand that knowing about a thing from reports is not the same as knowing the thing. I said, no. Not the way you know it. This was apparently the correct answer, because she continued. Harlan said almost nothing during this. This was not, I came to understand, because he was disengaged. It was because he had already heard most of it, the version she had told him gradually over 8 months of laundry exchange and the occasional conversation that neither of them had described as friendship because neither of them was comfortable with the word for different reasons. He sat with his coffee and he listened to the parts he already knew as though hearing them for the first time, which is a specific form of attention that I find rarer and more valuable than nearly anything else a person can offer. Once, when she described the moment the crowd had coalesced, the way it had moved from gathering to something more deliberate, his jaw did the complicated thing again. The thing I'd seen in the other man's jaw, the revision working. Except in Harlan's case, what he was working through was not a story he'd been told but a question: had he waited too long? I watched him carry this. He did not put it down. Later, much later, after I had left and come back and left again over the subsequent days, which I will get to, I asked him directly, "What made you come into town that day?" "You hadn't been in 11 months. He said, "Gerald needed shoes." I wrote this down verbatim. It is one of the most honest sentences I have ever recorded. The mule needed shoes. He was in town for a mule and he came around a corner and there was Siki in the middle of a crowd that had made up its mind, and he did the thing he did. No heroic architecture. A man and a mule and an encounter with a situation that his specific 34 years had made him unable to walk away from. I asked, "Did you know it might go badly? That they might not back down?" He said, "I didn't think about it. At all? I thought about whether I'd have to shoot someone," he said. "I decided I'd rather not." That's about as far as the thinking went. The particular weight of that afternoon settled over the ranch as the sun moved. The laundry on the line outside threw long shadows. Somewhere on the property something was making a rhythmic sound, a loose board, maybe, or a gate, and after a while it stopped and I didn't know if the wind had shifted or someone had fixed it. Siki rose at one point and went outside. I started to follow, some trained journalistic instinct toward the subject of interest, and Harlan said, without inflection, "Let her be." I sat back down. "She does that," he said. "She goes outside when she needs to think and she doesn't want company for it." "How do you know when she's done?" "She comes back in," he said, as though this were self-evident. As though the answer to most questions about other people were that simple and our failure to accept it was the actual problem. I thought about the notebook in my pocket. The instinct I trained to record, to capture, to taxonomize. I thought about the hair and the dust. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. "Probably not," he said. The moccasin on the shelf. The air in the room changed. Not dramatically, it doesn't, when you hit a real thing. Just a slight drop, like the temperature just before weather. "That's not a question," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." He looked at the shelf. He looked at it for long enough that I understood the count of what it held, the specific arithmetic of a small shoe, one, no pair, on a shelf in a house with no children in it. "My daughter," he said. "She'd be 10. "I'm sorry." He picked up his coffee cup. It was empty. He looked at it. "Her mother took her east when she was 2. Disease got her at 4. Fever." The telling was stripped to the studs. Nothing spared, nothing decorated. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said only to himself for a long time, in the flattest possible voice, because the flat voice is the only one that makes it possible to say it at all. "I kept the moccasin because it was here," he said. "She left it here." "When they left." Not, "I kept it because I needed to." Not, "I kept it because I couldn't let go." Just the unbearable simplicity of it was here. The love that manifests not as action but as the inability to remove an object from a shelf. I did not write this down. I should record that. In all my 19 years of fieldwork, this is the only time I made the active choice to hold something outside my notes, to let it belong to the room it was set in rather than to my files. Some things are not data. Siki came back in just before dark. She sat down at the table this time, not beside the window. She poured herself more coffee and looked at Harlan for a moment with an expression I could not read. Not gratitude, not exactly, because gratitude implies a debt, and she had given me the very clear impression that she did not deal in debts. Something more adjacent to recognition. The particular look of one person seeing another person clearly, and the recognition being mutual. I am going to stay here tonight, she said. Not a question. Yes, Harlan said. They will look for me. Yes, he said again. They will. And tomorrow? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have a cousin in New Mexico. Town called Mesilla. He's been asking me to come work his place for 3 years. I've been saying no. Siki turned her coffee cup in her hands. The silver at her wrists caught the lamp. And, now, she said. Now Gerald needs shoes, he said. And, Messia's got a farrier. She looked at him. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, not quite the thing that precedes a smile, but some internal movement in the direction of one. You are a very strange man, she said. That's not new information, he said. I stayed the night in the barn. Harlan's offer, spare and practical, take it or leave it. I lay in the straw with the lantern low and I opened my notebook. I had written almost nothing. For a man who had spent 19 years writing everything, the blankness of the page felt like either failure or the first honest thing I had done in a long time. I wrote, Siki. 22. Survivor of a dissolution. Laundry woman. The kind of person who knows exactly where to sit in a room. I wrote, Harlan. Rancher. 11 months of no town. A mule he is in a complicated relationship with. A moccasin he can't move. I wrote, the crowd. 30 people. A woman with controlled voice. Shears that were not put down fast enough. Then, I wrote, you stood at the edge. And then, because I had not slept in 30 hours and the straw was doing its best and the night outside was enormous and uninterested in my feelings about any of this, something has to change. The record or the recorder. I don't know which one I meant. I fell asleep before I could decide. The trouble arrived the next morning before the coffee had finished. 3 men. Horses. The specific quality of purpose that a man carries in his shoulders when he has spent the night working himself into something and arrived at his destination still carrying it. I was outside when they came up the road. I had woken early and was doing the thing I always did in the field, walking the perimeter of a place as though the geography itself had things to tell me. The desert at dawn has a particular color, something between rose and ash, and the scrub cast shadows that were longer than the plants themselves, which creates a strange doubling, the real brush and its elongated argument with the light. I heard the horses. I stopped walking. The lead man I did not know. He was perhaps 50, weathered in the specific way of men who have spent decades deciding they were right about things. Beside him rode the man with the shears. His name, I would learn, was Denner, and a third man, younger, who had the look of someone who had been brought along primarily to constitute a number. They pulled up at the edge of the property. The lead man looked at me. Where's Harlan? I said I would get him, which bought approximately 45 seconds. I went inside. Siki was at the table. Harlan was standing at the window. He had already heard the horses, I realized. He had been standing at the window for some time. 3, I said. I know. Denner's with them. He turned from the window. He had the look of a man arriving at a conclusion that he doesn't particularly like but finds structurally sound. Stay inside, he said to Siki. She looked at him with the precise expression I imagine she would have given someone who told her the sky was prone to weather. That is, he said, revising in real time, if you want to. I don't, she said. But, I will. He went out. I went with him, which he did not ask for and did not refuse. The lead man's name was Croft. He introduced himself with the comfort of a man accustomed to his name doing work, settling rooms, ending conversations. He had a very good horse and the kind of deliberate calm that is always more threatening than actual anger because it means the man has moved past needing to perform. Harlan. Croft. You've got a situation here. I've got a ranch, Harlan said. And a visitor. He indicated me with a tilt of his head, and I felt the brief, uncomfortable sensation of being used as social geometry. The Apache woman. The woman who does my laundry, Harlan said, in the same tone a person uses when they correct a mathematical error that is both simple and consequential. She's been living on your property. She's been working here. Yesterday she stayed because it wasn't safe for her in town, which I think we can agree is a fact rather than an accusation. Croft's jaw. The same complicated machinery I had now seen in 3 different jaws in 24 hours. What happened yesterday was a misunderstanding. I know what it was, Harlan said. I was there. The town has concerns. I have a cousin in Mesilla, Harlan said. I'm going to go see him. The abruptness of the pivot stopped Croft mid-sentence. Denner's horse shifted. That's so. That's so. Leaving this week. Taking Gerald, taking my tools, taking whatever fits in a wagon. He paused. Siki comes with me or she doesn't, that's her choice to make. But, she leaves Cabra Wells with my wagon if she wants to, and nobody stops that wagon. The arithmetic in the air between them was simple and both men knew it. Croft could escalate. Harlan had a Winchester and an apparently infinite supply of the specific stubbornness that comes from having already lost the thing that mattered most to you and, therefore having very little left to be threatened with. Denner said, not to Harlan, almost to himself, she could make trouble in Mesilla too. Her kind always don't, Harlan said. Just the one word. But, the word had been stored somewhere and, released with such flatness, such absolute depletion of patience for the sentence being constructed, that Denner stopped. Croft looked at his hands. At his horse. At the middling horizon of scrub desert that was not giving him any useful intelligence. I don't want trouble, he said, which was either true or the correct thing to say and, probably both. I know, Harlan said. Nobody ever does. They left. The younger man last, glancing back once with an expression that was difficult to read, not hostility, something more conflicted, the look of a person who had arrived expecting one kind of morning and gotten a different one and wasn't sure yet what to do with the revision. I thought, 20 years from now that man might tell a story about this morning. Or he might not. The stories we tell and the stories we bury are often more revealing than each other. I went back inside. Siki was still at the table. She had not, as far as I could tell, moved an inch during the entire exchange, but the quality of her stillness had changed. It was no longer the careful stillness of someone waiting to know what they would need to do. It was the stillness of someone who had heard an answer she hadn't known she was waiting for. She was looking at the table. He said that, she said. Not to me. Slightly to the left of the room. He did, I said. Her choice to make. Yes. She turned her coffee cup. Nobody says that. I did not contradict her because she was right and we both knew it. The next 3 days are compressed in my field notes to the point of near invisibility, because I was writing and not writing simultaneously, making the observer's notes and then writing over them, crossing lines out, rewriting, arriving at versions of sentences that were more honest than their predecessors and then finding that honesty insufficient. I was working through something. I won't pretend otherwise. What happened practically was this: Harlan sold 2 cattle, traded a third for wagon repair, and began packing the accumulated weight of 11 months of a life into boxes. He was ruthlessly efficient. He moved through the house with the systematic focus of a man who has done this before, packed up and left, and who has therefore developed a heuristic for which objects are in the space they require. Most things did not. The moccasin he wrapped in a piece of cotton and placed in the bottom of a small box lined with old newspaper. He put the box in the wagon himself. He did not comment on this, and I did not record it in my official notes, though I have written it here. Siki worked alongside him without being asked. This was not servitude. I want to be precise about this, because the instinct to read it as such is itself the problem. It was something more like the efficient collaboration of two people who have discovered, without formal announcement, that they are solving the same problem. She packed her own things. There were fewer than I would have expected, fewer than seemed sufficient for a person. 2 bundles. The silver at her wrists, which she never removed. A knife that she wore at her back end, handled with the ease of something that has been part of the body's vocabulary for years. I helped where I could, which was less than I would have liked. On the second afternoon, I sat beside Siki while she repaired a strap on one of the bundles. Her hands moved without thought, the needle going through leather with the steadiness of something practiced into reflex. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She kept stitching. "You can ask. What will you do in Messiah?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then, "I don't know yet." "Is that all right?" The needle went through leather. "I have been many places I didn't plan to go," she said. "Not knowing is not the hard part." "What's the hard part?" She stopped stitching. Looked at the strap. Something moved in her face, not grief exactly, but its cousin, the specific expression of a person encountering a memory that has not yet decided how much weight to carry. "Arriving," she said. "Every time you arrive somewhere new, you have to decide which parts of yourself to bring inside." I sat with this. "And, which parts do you leave outside?" She looked at me. Not unkindly. "The ones the last place made." On the evening before the departure I went for a walk and found Harlan behind the barn, doing something to Gerald's feet that Gerald objected to but, ultimately permitted. The sunset was the kind that the territory produces in the fall, layered in colors that seem excessive, as though the sky is compensating for something. "Are you afraid?" I asked, because I had been thinking about it for 3 days and had no other way in. Harlan thought about this without stopping his work. "Of what?" "Messiah. Starting over." "I've started over before." "Different this time." He looked at me briefly over Gerald's back. "Because of her?" "Because of both of you," I said. "You're both starting over. Together but separately. That's a complicated piece of geometry." He went back to Gerald's feet. Gerald made a sound of pointed commentary. "I don't think about geometry," Harlan said. "What do you think about?" He straightened up. Rolled his neck. Looked at the sunset that was still being excessive out there on the horizon. "Whether there's decent grazing land near the cousin's place," he said. "Whether Gerald can handle the ride without losing another shoe. Whether I remembered to pack the good rope. That's all?" "That's enough," he said. "That's enough to get to the next place. The rest is what you figure out after you get there." I thought of Siki. The ones the last place made. These 2 people, I thought. These 2 very separate and very similar people, carrying their carefully unpacked losses toward a town they'd never seen, planning next to nothing beyond the practical, trusting the afterward to resolve itself when they reached it. It was the least romantic possible description of what I was watching. It was also the bravest. That night I heard them talking through the wall of the barn. Not the words, the tone. The specific rhythm of a conversation that is not performing itself for anyone, that has moved past the stage of careful construction into something easier, something that sounds like 2 people who have been alone for a long time and have discovered, provisionally and without announcement, that being alone is a choice rather than a condition. I lay in the straw and listened to that rhythm, and I felt something I was not prepared to catalog. My pen was uncapped again. The ink stain on my finger. I capped it. The night outside was enormous and the stars were doing the thing stars do in the desert, which is being numerous beyond all reasonable necessity. Gerald was asleep on his feet in the corner of the barn, his contempt for the world briefly suspended. I was in the middle of something. I didn't have a word for it. Something that had started with a crowd and shears and a woman who stood like she'd already taken inventory of what could be taken from her and decided it wasn't everything. Something that was making the margin notes feel, for the first time in 19 years, like they might be the main text after all. We left Cabra Wells on a Tuesday in the third week of October. Gerald led the wagon with the resigned competence of an animal that has accepted its fate while reserving the right to complain about it at any moment. The town, what remained of Cabra Wells's investment in our departure, watched us go from the main street without gathering. This was, I had come to understand, a specific kind of restraint that was not the same as indifference, but looked like it from the outside, which may have been the point. I was riding alongside the wagon rather than in it, a distinction I had made for reasons I did not examine too closely. Something about the act of occupying the wagon felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't been invited across. I was still the observer. I was still a man with a notebook on his person even if I was writing in it less. Siki sat on the wagon bench beside Harlan. She had her 2 bundles in the bed behind her. The silver at her wrists caught the morning light intermittently, a small cold flash each time the wagon moved. She did not look back at the town. I looked back at the town. I am constitutionally unable to stop looking back at things. Cabra Wells receded into its own dust. It looked, from a distance, like any other collection of structures insisting on itself against the desert. It looked like nothing happened here. The road to New Mexico through the Southern Territory was not a short road. I want to be accurate about the geography because I have spent my career being sloppy about it, letting the emotional content of events swallow the physical reality, which is a form of dishonesty that I had been slowly recognizing as a problem. The journey was approximately 4 days, contingent on weather, Gerald's feet, and the temperament of the road in late October, which had opinions. The first day was mostly silence and space. The desert does not encourage small talk, it is too large and too absolute in its indifference, and there is something about moving through a landscape that simply does not care about your narrative that either breaks you open or compresses you, and I had seen it do both to various people over the years. For Harlan it seemed to do neither, which I found remarkable. He drove with the same stripped-down attention he'd applied to everything else, the horse, the road, the horizon, in that order, rotating. He did not appear to be thinking about the future or the past. He appeared to be precisely, specifically present, and the precision of it was something I had to keep not staring at. Siki was different. On the first day she was watchful in the way I had noticed from the beginning, taking inventory, noting exits, a vigilance so practiced it didn't look like vigilance anymore, just the way she moved her eyes. But, on the second day something began, very slowly, to ease. I noticed it first in her hands. The hands in her lap that had been, even in repose, held with a certain preparedness, began to rest. Not dramatically. Half an inch of difference in how the fingers lay. The kind of change that only a person who has been watching people for a living would note and that most people would miss, and that told me, more accurately than any interview, that she was calculating the distance from Cabra Wells and finding it, incrementally, sufficient. The morally heavy thing happened on the second night. We camped in a rock formation that provided wind cover, which was the entire criterion for campsite selection and the only correct criterion for campsite selection. I had made the fire. Harlan had done something efficient and necessary with the wagon's wheel, which had been speaking in a voice that suggested it had grievances. Siki had disappeared into the dark for 20 minutes and come back with firewood, which she produced without comment, because she was not the kind of person who required acknowledgement for having done the obvious useful thing. We were eating. Harlan had made something that could generously be called stew when we heard the riders. 2 of them. Coming from the east, which was the direction we'd come from. I saw Harlan's hand move to his side before his face moved at all. Siki went absolutely still, not the listening stillness of before, but a different one. Coiled. The riders came into the firelight and I recognized one of them, the young man from Croft's party. The one who had ridden away last and looked back. He held up both hands before he'd fully stopped his horse. "Not trouble," he said. "I promise you, not trouble." The other man I didn't know. Older. The shape of someone who travels regularly, not a rancher. The saddle was roan. Harlan said nothing. His hand hadn't moved from his side. "I'm sorry," the young man said. He was talking to Siki. His eyes went to her and then, sideways, and then, back, the specific eye path of someone addressing an apology they don't know how to aim. For what happened? In town. I went alone because I thought I don't know what I thought. The fire crackled. Gerald, tethered nearby, opened one eye and closed it. Siki looked at the young man for a long moment. What do you want? She said. I wanted to say that. You said it. The young man's companion turned out to be a traveling merchant who had come along for the company and the safety of numbers and had nothing to do with Cabra Wells's business with any of us. He sat his horse with the polite discomfort of a man who has arrived at someone else's scene and would like to be somewhere else but is too far from anywhere for that to be practical. The young man, his name was Billy, he offered it without being asked, looked at Harlan. Croft won't follow you, he said. I asked him directly. He said it was done. I didn't ask, Harlan said. I know. I wanted you to know anyway. Something moved in Harlan's face. The slight weather shift. All right, he said. All right? Thank you for coming, Harlan said. That was a long ride to deliver an apology. Billy nodded. He looked at Siki once more, and this time he kept his eyes on her, which took something from him. I could see it take something. I'm sorry, he said again. It doesn't fix anything. She looked at him. No, she said. It doesn't. The merchant shifted in his saddle. Gerald opened both eyes this time, assessed the situation, returned to his internal assessment of the world, which remained negative. They rode away. The fire settled. I thought that was the honest version. The version where the apology doesn't erase the thing or transform it, where the person who was harmed doesn't have to perform forgiveness for the comfort of the person apologizing. The version where two people look at each other over a fire and say, this happened. It can't unhappen. And then, the night continues. I looked at Siki. She was looking at the fire. Her hands were in her lap, still the new loose way. But, around her eyes, the very outside corners, something that was not tears but was the closest neighbor of tears. She felt me looking. She did not look back. Write it down, she said. What? Write it down. What he said. That it doesn't fix anything. She paused. Right that she said, no, it doesn't. And she kept going anyway. Asterisk I took out my notebook. I wrote it down. The road into New Mexico changed character somewhere past the border, became more decided, somehow, more confident in its direction. The scrub gave way to larger things, mountains visible in the middle distance, a sky that was wider or perhaps just differently framed by the elevated land. Harlan's cousin's place was a half-day south of Mesilla proper. We came upon it in the late afternoon of the fourth day, a modest operation, more chickens than the situation perhaps demanded, an outhouse that was visibly newer than everything else, a man in his 40s standing in the yard with the look of someone who had been expecting this and had run out of the kind of patience that pretends not to have been waiting. His name was Thomas. He was Harlan's cousin in the way that only people who have corresponded regularly for decades without meeting can be related, intimate and slightly formal at once. He had a wife, Clara, who came out of the house wiping her hands on her apron and took inventory of the wagon's contents with the professional efficiency of a woman who has been solving logistics for 20 years. She looked at Siki. Siki looked at her. Clara said, "You can stay in the east room. It's small. The window sticks, but if you lift it and push left it goes." "Thank you," Siki said. "You cook?" "Yes." "I hate cooking," Clara said with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Perfect." And that was the negotiation. It was both less and more than I'd expected, which is usually the nature of the moments that actually matter. I stayed 3 days in Mesilla before the road back to Tucson pulled at me the way roads pull. In those 3 days I watched Harlan relearn the social geometry of being around people. It was effortful and visible, like a man remembering a language he hadn't used in years, finding the words, slightly slow, slightly uncertain, but finding them. Thomas seemed to understand that the relearning was happening and gave it room without naming it, which was its own form of sophistication. Siki cooked. She was, as it turned out, an extraordinary cook, and Clara's relief was not performative. Clara had the specific culinary relationship with food that results from years of feeding people while actively disliking the process. Watching Siki in the kitchen was watching someone at work in a language they had never stopped speaking. The East Room window did stick. I heard Siki lifting it on the second morning, the specific sound of lift and push left, and then the sound of the window opening, and then a quality of silence that was different from the previous silences. A chosen silence. The silence of someone sitting at an open window in a place that is new and considering whether it might, with time, become something else. The morning I left, Harlan walked me to my horse. The sun was still low, the morning still doing its rose and ash negotiation with the day. "Will you come back this way?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "The survey sends me where it sends me." "The survey," he said. The flatness in the word was not contempt, more the specific neutrality of a man who has encountered institutions and found them to be what they are. "I know," I said. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "What you write." I thought about this. The honest answer was that I didn't know, that my field reports went into files and the files went into archives and the archives were consulted by men in offices in Washington who were making decisions with them that I had, over 19 years, come to suspect were not the decisions I was making when I wrote them. I thought about the gap between the record and the use of the record. I thought about the hair and the dust in Cabra Wells and whether it was in any file anywhere with anyone's name attached. "I don't know," I said. "I'm working on that." He accepted this, which was either generosity or the efficiency of a man who has learned to accept honest uncertainty. "She'd like you to do it right," he said. "Not accusatory. Just information." "I know," I said. He offered his hand. I shook it. Siki was at the east window when I led my horse past the side of the house. She was looking out toward the mountains. She heard me and looked down. "Edmund," she said. No one had called me Edmund since my mother. I had been Pruitt in the field so long the first name had become theoretical. "Siki," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "Write it the way it was," she said. "Not the way it should have been. The way it was." "Yes." "And write the interval," she said. "Between your second thought and your third. The ink stain on my finger. The uncapped pen. The crowd and the shears and the specific length of time between I should stop this and I don't know how." "Yes," I said. She nodded. She looked back at the mountains. I rode north through a morning that was cool and indifferent and enormous. I thought about what she had said. Not the instruction, the act of giving it. A 22-year-old woman who had come west on her own from the residue of a dissolution, who had built a working life from thin material, who had stood in the middle of a crowd with shears and not broken, who had looked at me the morning after with those creek-water eyes and read my interval to the second. That woman had charged me with something. Write it the way it was. Including the interval. Including the edge of the crowd and the uncapped pen and the man who did not move while the man who wasn't even there for her came around a corner and told the crowd to put down its shears. Including herself. Not as a subject of study. As a person who had survived and kept going and looked at an open window in the morning and lifted and pushed left until it gave. I have one last thing to record before I close this account. 2 weeks after I left Mesilla, I was in Tucson filing my reports when a letter arrived. Not from the survey, not from an institution. A letter in handwriting I didn't recognize, angular, efficient, the handwriting of someone who writes sparingly and, therefore, writes carefully. There was no greeting. No signature. One sentence: "The window does not stick anymore." I held the letter for a long time. Then, I filed it. Not with the survey's reports. In a different place. The private file I had started keeping, at some point in the last month, for things that were not data. There is a difference between knowing about a thing and knowing the thing. I am still learning this. Some intervals are longer than others.